It happened in the Gulf of Mexico in the month of November. The American sailing schooner Maria, commanded by Captain Thomas Jenkins, was on her way to Mexico with a cargo of oil cake in the hold. It was night, and a fresh wind was blowing from the east, cold and with rain. The wind was almost a tailwind. The heavy, wet sails barely loomed in the dark sky as black specks. Cold streams of water ran down the masts and tackle. The wet deck was dark and slippery. However, there was no one to walk now. One helmsman stood at the helm and shivered when a cold jet from his hat hit his collar. In the sailor's cabin in the bow of the ship, 5 sailors slept in bunks in the damp stuffiness. It smelled sourly of tobacco and filthy human habitation. Billy the boy was bitten by fleas and couldn't sleep. It was stuffy. He got up, fumbled for the gangway, and went out on deck. He pulled his tattered coat over his head and slapped barefoot on the wet planks. He could hear the ripples whipping aft. Billy had learned the deck well in 2 years, and he never stumbled in the dark. The sea seemed as black as ink, with only a few white scallops scuttling about. Billy peered through the hatch of the captain's cabin. The light of a cigar was flickering there. "Hey," cried Jenkins. "Who's there?" "Billy." "Come on in." Billy went down to the cabin. "Did the boys put out the fire?" Well, they're burning kerosene for nothing. They don't think people live with candles in the country." Not only was there no fire in the cabin, but also the navigation lights on the sides were out, green on the right and red on the left. By these lights, ships recognize each other at night and avoid collisions. "Since you are awake," continued the captain, "then do not sleep. There may meet steamships. Keep your eyes on the sea." Billy approached the helmsman. "Why are you shivering?" asked the helmsman. "Are you afraid of the hole?" "I'm cold," said Billy. "What's the pit?" "You don't know?" Billy had heard many stories about the pit, and he didn't believe them, but he still liked to listen. At night, he was afraid that there might be one. "There's no pit," said Billy. "Have you seen it?" "I did see it. It's always rippin'. It howls. I was sailing with the Mexicans once, and I saw a ship pulled in there, and then it was gone." "You lying?" Billy was scared. "Honest to God, steamboats get sucked in." "Where is it?" "Right in the middle of the bay. The Mexicans know." "You're lying!" Billy waved me off. "I'm telling the truth. That's why the captain won't sleep," added the helmsman in a low voice. "He's afraid of the pit." "Billy!" shouted the captain from the cabin. "Look at the lights. You're hanging your ears." Billy peered into the darkness, and indeed, far ahead, on the right, he saw a white light. He listened to see if the pit was humming ahead. The American freight steamer Mary, with a full cargo of grain, was traveling along the western shore of the Gulf of Mexico toward the Straits of Florida, to go on from there to New York. Green and red lights shone brightly along the sides. Strong electric lamps were burning there. Another white light was burning on the mast. This light on the mast is worn by steamers, unlike sailing vessels, to which steamers must always give way at sea. The steamer was newly built. Everything was new, and the serviceable machinery ran like clockwork. At the bow of the vessel stood the watchman and looked ahead. There also hung a large signal bell, which the watchman used to let the captain's mate know when a fire would appear on the horizon. If it struck once, the fire would be on the right, twice, on the left, 3 times, directly in the path of the steamer. The young assistant captain, navigator James, was on watch and paced back and forth on the captain's bridge. Suddenly he heard 3 hurried blows on the bell from the bow. He looked forward, almost in front of the bow of the steamer, faintly flashing green light. "Left rudder," James shouted to the helmsman, and the steamer rolled sharply to the left. The rails of the sailing ship almost hit the steamer. "Damn them! Savages!" For the fourth time, James grumbled to himself. "On course," he commanded the helmsman. The helmsman turned the wheel, the steering machine clanked, and the steamer went on its course. Captain Arthur Price sat on a leather sofa in his cabin, which was just off the bridge. 2 electric lights burned above a polished table on which stood a bottle of whiskey and a siphon of soda water. The captain was smoking a pipe of fragrant tobacco and writing down in his leather album his impressions of the last voyage. He was afraid that he would forget during the long journey and not be able to tell his New York friends much about the voyage. "In the streets, people are talking loudly, shouting," he wrote. "On the sidewalks, jostling and not apologizing." Bang, 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 there came 3 blows from the bow again. Captain Price put on his cap and jumped out of the cabin. "What's the matter, James? Again?" he asked the mate. "Starboard, more starboard," James commanded. The red light slipped past the port side very close. "Are they kidding me?" said Price. "We have a legal duty to yield to a sailing ship," replied James. "But the law, Mr. James, forbids you to go to sea without lights, like pirates. Or do you think it is right when lights suddenly appear 10 feet away?" said the captain admonitively. "What then, to ram?" James asked. "You have to be firm when you're right." "Of course I should have been taught a lesson," James said weakly. "Well, don't change course in such cases, James," said Price. The captain turned abruptly and went to his cabin. Arthur Price imagined his steamer, smoothly painted a beautiful gray, burning with bright electric lights, clean, strong, proudly walking among these dilapidated sailing ships. A gentleman in a crowd of savages. He remembered how in one port he had been pushed twice in the street. Damn it! Before he knew it, the offender had disappeared. There had never been an opportunity to teach that crowd a lesson. Arthur Price imagined how he would talk about it in New York, and how everyone would be waiting for him to say how he had managed to show these savages who they were dealing with. And there was nothing to say. Price was greatly annoyed with himself. "Here's a missed opportunity with this sailboat. That brute James, I should have just fucked him. Enough mincing about, carry the lights out to sea. What an opportunity that was," chagrined the captain. Price went out on the bridge again. He hoped, after all, that another opportunity might present itself, and he did not count on James. "They seem to have trained you, James," he said caustically to his mate. "You are as good at evading these gentlemen as a lackey in a restaurant." James was silent and stared ahead. "Captain," Billy shouted to the captain. "There's the fire again. The steamer's coming right at us." Jenkins looked out of the cabin. "A big steamer indeed," he said after a moment's silence. "Must be a grain ship from New Orleans. Where did you leave that old rope, Billy? It'll make good rope." "Captain." "Oh, give me the lantern," shouted Billy. He kept his eyes on the steamer, and it was clear to him that if the steamer did not turn in a minute, a collision was inevitable. The helmsman couldn't stand it any longer and began to turn to the left. "What are you afraid of?" shouted Jenkins. "Keep the course as it was." "Give me a match," he said to Billy. Billy snatched a box of matches from the captain's hands and rushed into the cabin, fumbled for a lantern on the wall, struck a match, red. He needed the right one, the green one. Hastily, with trembling hands, Billy struck match after match. They broke. They went out. He could not light the wick. It lit. Billy slammed the door shut. The lantern flickered and went out. "Don't give in to the wind," he heard the captain shouting upstairs to the helmsman. Billy struck matches again, feeling that every second was worth a life now. At last, He ran out on deck with the green light and pointed the lantern toward the steamer. The steamer was quite close, and it seemed to Billy that the red and green eyes of the steamer were staring straight ahead. He heard the bell there being hurriedly struck 3 times. "Keep it up!" shouted Jenkins in an angry voice. "Keep it up!" came a harsh command in English from the steamer. Without changing course, the Mary was heading straight for the sailboat. "Hard to port! Hard to port!" screamed Jenkins. But it was too late. Billy saw the tall prow of the steamer coming at them out of the darkness with unstoppable force, unseen, heading for the very center of the vessel. He was afraid that the steamer was going to crush him, Billy. He let the lantern out on the deck, rushed toward the Vandas, and climbed the mast like a monkey. "Hey, hey!" shouted the captain and helmsman in one voice. But at almost the same moment, they were both knocked off their feet by the shock of the steamer, smashing into the vessel at full speed. There was a terrible crunching sound. Billy was jolted, and he could barely keep his footing on the cables. A few feet away, he saw the gray hull of the ship clearly. He closed his eyes, shrank back, and clung to the cables with all his might. Something rumbled and thumped. The mast swayed, and when Billy opened his eyes, he saw the receding lights of the steamer, and down below, he could make out nothing. The water was a few feet below him. He climbed higher and saw with horror that the water was rising behind him. He stood on the ceiling and straddled the stem, keeping his eyes on the water. A black blind ripple was going about down there, but it was not going higher now, as if the mast had ceased to sink. But Billy did not believe it, and did not take his eyes off the water. Captain Price was silent and looked ahead, as if expecting something more. It seemed to him that there was more to come, and the Mary kept moving away from the wreck. The crew sprang on deck, all anxiously asking the watchman what had happened. "All right, yes, all right," thought Price. He himself had not expected it to be like this, and now his frightened conscience was looking for excuses. "Captain, there are still people out there, aren't there?" James said in a worried voice. "Yes, answered Price, not understanding the words of his assistant. "Starboard," James shouted to the helmsman. "Reverse course." "Reverse course," replied the helmsman hastily. Aye, reverse course," said Price, as if coming to his senses. The crew, without orders, prepared the dinghy for launching. The Mary steamed back toward the wreck. The sailors crowded on the bow and, exchanging anxious words, stared intently into the darkness of the night. "It must be here," said James. "Stop the car," Price commanded. Mary was slowly accelerating, but no one could see anything. Price commanded, and the steamer made circles. At last it was clear to all that the wreck could not be found, not even the floating wreckage in the darkness of the rainy autumn night. Find it," whispered Price. "Find them all, they swim here. They can swim well. We'll save them all," he said aloud. "Won't we, James?" James was silent. Yes, the captain answered himself, and he spun, then increasing the stroke, then suddenly stopped the car. It went on like that for about an hour. "On course," said James, in a low voice, coming up to the helmsman, and gave the car full throttle. Mary went on her way northward again. "There are lights showing 10 feet away, James, aren't there?" said Price. "I don't know, Captain," answered the mate without turning his head. Price retired to his cabin. Now he was thinking. There are people left at sea out there, and they'll be rescued. Well, maybe one. He'll tell. And if they're all drowned, the sailboat won't be missed so soon. He tried to reassure himself by remembering the stories he had heard from fellow sailors. Somehow everyone had come out victorious, and it had even been fun and funny. He tried to think cheerfully, but he happened to see his face in the mirror, and he felt scared. It seemed to him that now it was not he who was driving the steamer, but James who was taking him, Price, there to Miami. It seemed to him that the most important thing was to get out of this damned bay, to sneak across the strait without being recognized. Damn gray. All the steamers were black. If only they were black. He wanted to jump up and smear that treacherous gray color. Suddenly Price got up, went out, and walked quickly to the navigator's cabin where the nautical charts lay. After 5 minutes, he came up to James and said, "Lie down on a course northwest 87 degrees. The Mary turned steeply to the right. When Price left, James looked at the map. They were heading for the mouth of the Mississippi. An American passenger steamer was returning from a voyage to New Orleans. The strong east wind that had been blowing all night had stirred up a big swell. Low clouds carried over the sea. It was dawning. The shivering watch navigator wrapped himself in his coat and from time to time looked through his binoculars, looking for the Cape Fear lighthouse, and waited for his shift. "You can't see the lighthouse yet," he said to his comrade, "but there's a landmark over there. There shouldn't be any. Take a look," and he handed over the binoculars. Yes, he said, looking at it. "Wait, there's something on it. It's a mast, really, a mast." They reported to the captain, and so the steamer, dodging out of the way, went to this mast sticking out of the water. Soon the whole crew found out that they were going to some mast, and they all came on deck. "I'll be damned! There's a man on it!" shouted a sailor. But from the bridge they had long ago recognized the man through binoculars, and now they ordered to lower the dinghy. It was difficult to do so in such a rough seas, and the dinghy was nearly smashed against the side of the steamer. But everyone was racing to get help and find out what was the matter. Even the passengers, pale with seasickness, came on deck and came to life. The steamer was very near, and it was plainly visible to all that a boy was standing on the sailing of the mast, sticking out of the water. Everyone was watching the dinghy diving in the quicksand. It was impossible to approach the mast so that someone could climb over it, and the boy did not go down. They could see how they shouted from the dinghy and waved their hands. "Dead, dead," said the passengers. "He froze, poor fellow." But the boy suddenly moved. He must have moved his arms with difficulty, unraveling the rope around his body. Then he staggered and plunged into the water near the dinghy, almost hitting the side. He was picked up. Billy was almost senseless. It was with difficulty that they managed to wring a few words out of him. In the night, gray, our Maria, full throttle into the side. He soon fell into unconsciousness and raved incoherently. But the sailors had already realized what had happened, and the same day telegrams flew from the port. It was not difficult to establish what gray steamer could be in this place that night. 5 days after the wreck of the Maria, a black American steamer came to Miami and anchored in the strait. The navigator went in a dinghy to present his papers to the harbor authorities. An hour later, a dinghy with an American flag came to the steamer from the shore. "I am a representative of the Coast Guard," said the boarding officer to the sailor on watch. "Show me to the captain." The captain stood up as the guest appeared in the cabin doorway. "I am the local representative of the authorities. May I have a word with you? You're Captain Arthur Price, aren't you?" "Yes, sir." The captain blushed and frowned. He was worried and forgot to invite his guest to sit down. "Where are you coming from?" the officer asked. "My papers are on shore." "I don't need them. I take the American's word for it." "From Mobile, sir." "But you were coming from the Gulf of Mexico?" the officer asked. "Did you have a cargo for mobile?" "Repairs," Price said. He was having trouble catching his breath, and the officer was sorry to see how worried the man was. "A little repairs, sir, at the dock." "And was it repainted there?" the officer asked. Price was silent. The officer pulled a telegram from his wallet and silently handed it to Price. Price unfolded the paper. His eyes ran over the letters. He couldn't read anything, but he saw that it was the very thing he had been so afraid of. He dropped his hand with the telegram on the table, looked at the officer, and was silent. "Perhaps you will come with me. You will calm down and explain yourself," said the officer at last. Price put on his cap and began to stuff things from the table into his jacket pockets, not realizing what he was doing. "Don't worry, you can send for the stuff from shore," the officer said. James met them on deck. He already knew what was wrong. "I'm sorry," he addressed the officer. Only one boy was saved. He's home and healthy," the officer replied. "There were 8 of them." Price shuddered, and overtaking the officer without looking about, walked with quick steps towards the dinghy. He wished now that he had been arrested sooner. The next day, the Black Mary sailed for New York under the command of Edward James, the navigator.